from the world of politics.
Well, I think people want everyone to be held accountable to the law. Whether you're a president, a past president, or an average citizen, nobody is above the law, and that's really the reaction that I've had.
To the world of business.
We probably have seen the peak of inflation, but I think Mary Daly got it exactly right. This is hardly the time to call the war over.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome now to Balance of Power. Well, we've begun the week with some economic numbers. We got the Empire State numbers today, which were really low, really disappointing. We also got some housing sentiment numbers, which were down, but maybe they pale in comparison to the really big numbers that came first out of China and a slowing Chinese economy. To take us through exactly what this means for the economy, both in the United States and globally, welcome Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So, Mike, it looks like things are slowing down.
You know how the Chinese used to talk about one country, two systems? Well, we've got two systems here, but one result. Bad economic data in both China and the United States. The Chinese worse, although not a surprise, because we knew the economy was slowing. You shut it down completely because you're doing COVID zero, and this is what you get. And unfortunately for the Chinese, it came in even worse than expected. That was the minor surprise. Industrial production, retail sales, and fixed asset investment all extremely weak during the month. And then a real problem for President Xi, and that is unemployment for the youth group. We are looking at 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds, sort of the backbone of the future workforce of China, and it hit 20%. The other two categories there are the rest of the unemployment numbers, and you can see the difference. There is a real problem for the Chinese going forward, which explains why the central bank today cut interest rates, but only by 10 basis points. So people think they're going to come at it again and cut again. In the U.S., of course, we are raising interest rates, and the concern is, are we seeing a negative effect on the economy? Certainly that came through in the Empire numbers from the state of New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, noting that the economy seems to have fallen off a cliff in terms of manufacturing during the month of August. General business conditions down 42 points. New orders, shipments, employment, all taking a hit. Is this an outlier, or is this what we're going to see from other regions? That's going to be the real question, David.
And it's pretty sobering, no question about it. Thank you so much to Michael McKee, Bloomberg's own. And now we turn to one of the people that all of us listen to about where we think the economy is going. He's Nouriel Roubini, NYU Stern School Professor of Economics Emeritus and CEO of Roubini Macro Associates. So, Dr. Roubini, thank you so much for being with us. You have warned about stagflation, and some of the numbers we're seeing in slowdown might point in the direction of the stag part. What about the inflation part? Is it possible that the slowing down will actually avoid some of the inflation you're concerned about?
Well, inflation in the United States is still 8.5%. It might have peaked, but the question is how fast it's going to fall. With the Fed still having real rates on the policy side highly negative, I don't think the monetary policy is tight enough to push inflation towards 2% fast enough. So I'm still of a view that in the past, in the US, whenever you had inflation above 5% and unemployment below 5%, the Fed tightening has led to a hard landing. So my baseline is a hard landing.
So we got those CPI and PPI numbers out last week that the markets found encouraging. What did you take from them? Does that indicate we have peaked?
Yes, we may have peaked, even if there could be further spikes in inflation driven by China continuing with zero COVID policy. The war between Russia and Ukraine could get worse, and therefore you could have further spikes to commodity prices, whether energy, food, fertilizer, industrial metals. So there are plenty of upsides. And what goods inflation may be going down, service inflation, especially shelter and others, is still quite persistent. And wages are growing much higher than productivity. Therefore, there is a wage price spiral, even if wages are growing less than prices. So we are still in a severely inflationary environment, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Dr. Roubini, you mentioned the negative real rate. In your opinion, what does the Federal Reserve have to do? How much hiking do they need to do to really put a stop to inflation?
Well, they're already saying that by the end of the year, they should be at 3.4. and then by 3.8 at the end of next year. So markets expecting a pivot in the Fed cutting rates next year, to me, sounds delusional. But even if you were at 3.8 with inflation still well above target, around 8%, falling only gradually, core inflation around 6-ish, you're still in negative territory. So the Fed funds rate should be going well above 4%, 4.5% to 5% in my view, to really push inflation towards 2. If that doesn't happen, inflation expectations are going to get unhinged. Or if that happens, then we're going to have a hard landing. So either way, either you get a hard landing or you get inflation getting out of control.
To avoid that unhinging, as you put it, of inflation expectations, does the Fed need to get to 2, or what if it got to 3?
Well, they're going to get initially towards 3 and then to 2. But the point is that with headline being around 8.5 and with core being around 6-ish, even getting to 3 is going to be quite a challenge. And therefore, even getting to 3 implies effectively, in my view, a hard landing of the real economy. And the data suggests that we're headed towards that hard landing. You know, the Empire State measure today was terrible. The data out of China are terrible. The data out of Europe are terrible. The employment report was positive, but all the forward-looking indicators of the labor market, initial claims, job openings, quits, the ISM component that is employment, announcement of layoffs, and so on, all those are suggesting that there's a very sharp deceleration even of the labor market. Payroll numbers are a backward-looking indicator, not a forward-looking indicator. So we are in a sharp slowdown. We had 2 negative quarters of growth in the first half. We're going towards a recession.
So you've talked about a recession before, and even on Bloomberg, you said that it's delusional, to use that word again, to think that it's going to be relatively short and relatively shallow. Is that still your view?
Yes, it is my view, because we live in a world in which there is massive amounts of private and public debt. So if you go into a recession, zombie corporation, zombie financial institution, zombie household, zombie countries, zombie governments are going to go bust. Everybody's tightening at the same time. In the last 2 crises, GFC and COVID, we eased massively monetary and fiscal policy because it was a demand shock and we had deflationary pressure. This time around, we're going to be having to tighten monetary policy into a recession because inflation is above target. We don't have fiscal bullets, and with negative supply shocks, fiscal stimulus is the wrong policy response. So if you combine all these things together, not only we get stagflation with negative supply shock, we get a stagflationary debt crisis. So the recession is going to be long, protracted, severe, and associated with financial distress across the board.
We never like to say it's different this time, but is it slightly different this time in the sense that there is a lot of money still on the balance sheets of households and corporations? There's a lot of dry powder out there left over from a lot of that fiscal stimulus.
Well, both the corporate sector and the household sector are split. If you're in the top part of the distribution of the household sector, you have income, you have wealth, you have jobs. But, you know, in the bottom side, things are very stressed out, both in terms of P&L and the balance sheet. Same thing in the corporate sector. There were tons of firms that were highly leveraged, didn't have much profits, that were zombie, that would have gone bust. But during COVID, we bailed out everybody. 0 rate, negative rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, backstopping, money market, commercial paper, high yield, high grade, you name it. Now that we have to tighten as inflation is higher, the zombies are going to collapse. And both in the household sector, in the corporate sector, in the shadow financial system, some sovereigns and some countries, you have many, many parts of the global economy that are essentially zombie, and they're going to go bust. So the average essentially hides the fact that in terms of distribution, you have really stronger balance sheets and worse balance sheets, and the worst balance sheets are now dominant.
So to try to look for a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, is there possibly some encouragement from the elimination of some of the so-called zombie companies? In this sense, zombie companies typically occupy a fair amount of capital that's not as productive as it could be. Could the redeployment of capital actually increase productivity and help us, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium and longer term?
Yes, you know, in the medium long term, you have to get rid of the zombies because you need creative distraction. But that process is associated with a recession, with financial crisis, with massive defaults across the board. We saw some of that happening during the global financial crisis. The problem is that every time you try to do creative distraction, central banks come with an excuse to try to backstop household, corporates, financial system, governments, and so on. And that creates a cycle of a debt trap where you're using unconventional monetary, fiscal, and credit policy to backstop the system. You prevent essentially that trade destruction occurring, and you have increasing zombification of the economy. Private and public debt ratio globally used to be in 2000, 200% of GDP. Today, they're 350% and rising. In advanced economies are 420% and rising. In China, 330% of GDP and rising. In the US, private and public debt as a share of GDP is higher than during the Great Depression and after World War II. And we're not coming out of a major war or a Great Depression. So these debt levels are unsustainable across the world. And that's official debt. If you include implicit liability coming from aging, unfunded Social Security, healthcare, and so on, the number is even more staggering in terms of debt ratio and unsustainable debt conditions.
Wow, that's a lot to chew on, and really very helpful and informative. Thank you so much, Doctor. That's Nouriel Roubini of Roubini Macro Associates. Coming up, what comes next in the investigation of former President Trump's possession of classified documents? We're going to ask Suzanne Spaulding, former Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Lisa Mateo here with the first word. Lisa?
Good morning, David. Well, South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham must testify before a Georgia grand jury investigating possible interference in the 2020 presidential election. Now, that's according to a court ruling today. Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger says Graham called him twice in the weeks after the election and that he believed Graham wanted him to find a way to throw out legitimately cast mail-in ballots. Now, Graham has denied that. In Ukraine, lawmakers have voted to extend martial law by another 90 days. The measure was put in place after Russia invaded the country in February. Ukraine also plans to reintroduce a fuel tax, hoping to boost monthly budget revenue for social and infrastructure projects. The plan comes as Russian forces continue to shell cities and towns in East Ukraine, including Kharkiv. And London's Heathrow Airport has extended its capacity limits through the end of the summer season. The UK hub is struggling with a prolonged labor shortage and ground handling firms. A daily limit of 100,000 departing passengers will be in effect until October 29th. Heathrow officials say there have been fewer last-minute cancellations, better punctuality, and shorter wait times for bags since curbs were introduced. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So late Friday, we all got a glimpse, at least, of that search warrant that was executed on the premises of former President Donald Trump's home. And now we continue to debate through the weekend exactly what is going on and how much we do know. And by the way, how much we do not know about what is really going on. We welcome now an authority on national security. She's Suzanne Spaulding, former Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Spaulding is now associated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies as well as the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. But today she's appearing in her private capacity. So Suzanne, thanks so much for being with us. First of all, give us your perspective on the process here. You have classified documents that's specified in the search warrant. They are classified. There is a process by which the president can declassify them, as I understand. Is that an elaborate process? Is it possible that President Trump has already done that?
Well, it's certainly possible. We don't know. We don't have any indication at this point that he went through any kind of process to determine whether it was in the national interest to declassify these documents. And that's really the point of the process. Let's not get caught up in the legalistics here, but look at why is there a process in place for declassifying documents? It's so that the relevant departments and agencies can weigh in on the potential harm to national security that could come from declassifying these documents. A document that is classified top secret, that means that revealing that information was determined at the time to be something that would cause exceptionally grave damage to our national security. So before you declassify such a document, you want to get input from all of the folks who can help you discern and weigh the public interest and national interest in declassifying it against the potential damage to harm to Americans and to our national interest of doing so. That's why the process is so important.
So, Suzanne, at this point, it's going on in private, in secret, as it were, as it should. The review that's going on, I understand it, perhaps first to determine if there's attorney-client privilege material there, and then for a further review. Is it possible that the authorities will review these documents and say, yes, they were classified, but in fact, it wouldn't do that much harm to national security?
It certainly is possible. I mean, we know that there is sometimes overclassification in our system. But that is an analysis that has to be done very carefully. And the indications are there's some nuclear related material in there. It's important to understand that requires, access to nuclear weapons related information. It doesn't just require a top secret clearance or even a general top secret, what they call SCI, specially compartmented information clearance. It requires another level of vetting to get what's called a Q clearance. I mean, it is considered information that if it fell into the wrong hands, could cause exceptionally grave harm. It's very dangerous for Americans to have that information not properly handled. So again, I think this would be a very careful review. Those classifications are not put on lightly, nor should they be removed lightly.
I know that you spent time up on Capitol Hill, Suzanne, particularly with the Senate and House Intelligence Committee. There's now a suggestion coming from some members, Democratic members of the House of Representatives, saying, why don't we give it over to the Director of National Intelligence and have her review it and give us a read on the damage. Does that make sense?
It does, and I expect it's happening. I would expect that these documents are now being reviewed not just by folks at the Department of Justice, but by the departments and agencies that have expertise. In this case, again, if in fact there is material in there about nuclear weapons, whether our nuclear capabilities or that of our adversaries or our allies, that the Department of Energy is also involved in that review. The Department of Defense, I mean, by statute, the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense really manage the classification and the safeguarding of that important information. So I expect that's happening. It's also probably the case that whether it has begun or not, there will be some sort of damage assessment done by the intelligence community, given that there appears to be classified information that was not handled according to the safeguards that are in place for handling classified information. And therefore, they may look at this and say, we have to operate on the assumption that it's fallen into the wrong hands and what could be the damage to our national security. And that's done so that they can begin immediately to take steps to reduce that harm, if there are things they can do to mitigate the damage.
Suzanne, finally, let me ask a question that just came to me from a viewer, and you may or may not know the answer, actually, but I'm seeing a lot of speculation about it. And the question was very simply, why is this situation different from that email server that the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had?
Well, we have a situation here where we know we have classified information. At least the press reports have indicated that there may be nuclear related material in there. And we now have those documents back in government hands. And this is an appropriate process for them to go through. Under the circumstances that we're confronted with right now, it's important to think about, first and foremost, our national security. What is important to do to protect Americans? We need to understand what that information is, how it was handled, and whether we think there's real harm here that needs to be, where action needs to be taken to reduce that harm. So before we get into all of the issues around, will there be a prosecution? Was there a law violated? The first issue has to be protecting the security of the nation and the safety and security of the American public.
Okay, Suzanne, really appreciate your time and your expertise today. That's former Undersecretary of Homeland Security, Suzanne Spaulding. Still to come, we're going to talk with George Magnus of the Oxford China Center about the latest congressional trip to Taiwan and China's softening economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
as the world watches inflation rise, employment rebound, and fiscal policies react. All roads lead to Jackson Hole for the Kansas City Fed's 2022 Economic Policy Symposium. Bloomberg Surveillance is live as policymakers and financial insiders discuss the economic issues and solutions that keep the world's money moving. Coverage starts August 25th, only on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We've been talking about this hour. There's permanent economic data out this morning about the United States and China. I thought it might hurt the markets. I'm not sure they're hurting so badly, but Abigail Doolittle is here to tell us about it.
Well, David, it is a little surprising right now to see that we have stock indexes higher. Earlier, as you know, they were down, and that, of course, on that weak China data, of course, also the Fed, New York manufacturing data, the worst, I believe, since 2001 or 2009. And no matter what that data is, it's not so great. And here we have stocks higher. So this seems to be bad news is good news. But I have to say, relative to that New York Fed data and the China data, you know, when you have the world's largest economy and the world's second largest economy talking about slowdown economically, why aren't investors pricing it in? Probably has to do with the Fed. But at some point, it speaks to the froth that we've had recently. And I will call it that at this point, because there seems to be such a disconnect between some of these fundamentals and the markets, all on the idea that the Fed might not have to hike quite as much. That's not what the Fed's saying. And plus, we've had good data, the jobs report.
Yeah, that's right. Very good data on that. But take a couple of specifics. For example, housing. Because we're getting a lot of indications housing market is really rapidly softening.
It really is. You know, it's worrisome. Today we had the home builder sentiment index come out, and it's been down all year. It's in the longest losing streak going back to 2007. That, of course, was before the housing bubble popped then. I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but you have housing weakening significantly. This, of course, as the Fed is raising mortgage rates, sharply higher than they had been, say, a year ago. The trend is higher there. It suggests that you're going to continue to see that kind of weakness. And what makes this so interesting about the home builder sentiment, we of course have not a lot of supply of existing homes. That's why the home builders had been on fire for such a period of time, because they were able to build these new homes. The fact that they're cooling down a little bit, that was one of the earlier signals, frankly, ahead of the housing crisis.
Some people talk about bubble, but one more. Let's sneak in oil. And is that China, basically?
That's basically China. And also, you could say it's technicals. But yeah, I mean, China is the world's largest user of natural resources. So you have oil down, you have commodities down basically right across the board here on that idea that that economy is continuing to slow down and stay slower, and that there's going to be less demand. Technically, oil back below that 200-day moving average. I know some folks don't like that, but it really is sliding, and it appears if support doesn't kick in, you could go above 60.
But Abigail likes those technicals. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, China got off to a sort of rocky start this week as they came out with economic numbers, and it showed retail sales, industrial output, and investment was all down, and a 20% youth unemployment level. To give us a sense of how it looks for the Chinese economy right now, we welcome now George Magnus. He's associate of the Oxford China Center, and he's author of Red Flags: Why Xi Jinping's China is in Jeopardy. So, as I just said to you, you may turn out to be right here before we're done, George, but it's too soon to call it. Give us a sense of how the Chinese economy looks to President Xi Jinping this morning.
Not great, David. I mean, I think this is, it's not a kind of a new issue. This has been kind of brewing all year, really. And it achieved, the economy went into a sort of a kind of a nadir, really, during the Shanghai lockdown and other cities which went through similar kinds of experiences earlier in the spring and early summer. Now, it kind of picked up a bit in June, then July, again, another disappointment with the numbers that you alluded to. So zero COVID is obviously one of the big problems for the Chinese economy, but it's really just exacerbating what is already a pretty dire situation in China's real estate market, private investment, private consumption, very, very weak. So not great.
So, George, I wonder if a couple of those things play off of each other as President Xi's thinking, how do we turn this around? How do we get it growing again? Because as you mentioned the property market, my understanding is that a lot of Chinese actually essentially have their savings in their property. And as the values are going down, they're not as wealthy. They may not spend as much. At the same time, they're worried about getting shut down from moment to moment. We just had Hainan, for example, shut down.
Yeah, I mean, so for Chinese households, the property market represents about 3/4 of their wealth. Most of the rest is in bank deposits. So they don't really have high owning, share owning society. I mean, obviously there is share ownership, but it's not very big. So obviously Chinese urban-based middle class residents are very sensitive to what's going on in the real estate market. And as I'm sure everybody knows, for some time now, China's property developers have been in serious trouble with high debt, cash flow problems, not being able to complete construction projects. And a large proportion, last year it was about 90% of properties sold were pre-sold. In other words, people took out mortgages and had to start paying mortgages the moment they contracted to buy an uncompleted or unfinished apartment. And so, of course, people are very worried now about this situation. And a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, have joined a mortgage boycott in which they're refusing to pay their mortgage payments.
So what can President Xi do about this? We saw the central bank, the PBOC, today come out with a rate cut. But if the problem is the property market's down and the problem is you're worried about COVID shutdown, I'm not sure what lower rates are going to do to help that problem.
Yeah, it's a bit like taking a little watering can to a fire, to be honest. I mean, it has the hallmark of desperation, like the People's Bank of China's "we have to do something," and that's kind of what they did. They trimmed by 10 basis points a couple of their benchmark interest rates, but actually monetary policy isn't really the reason why China's economy is in trouble and why the property market is rolling over. So what does the government has to do? Obviously, they have to try to stop the rot, to try to stop or shore up confidence. And I guess the only thing they can really do to do that is to assure the middle class mortgage holders, obviously, that the properties that they think they're on the hook for are going to get completed and will get delivered. So that means that they've got to provide funding for somebody. So mostly that somebody is local governments, but local governments are strapped for cash, have too much debt, have other responsibilities to deliver economic growth. So it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And I think at the moment, especially ahead of the 20th Party Congress later this year, all that Xi Jinping can do, and the government can actually offer kind of firefighting tools to basically try to stabilize the situation. It's not going to get better quickly.
All of this is domestic within China and the economy of China. What about externally, and particularly Taiwan, with Speaker Pelosi's visit over there? Now we have Ed Markey conducting another congressional delegation over there. How does that play into Xi's calculus, as it were? Does it allow him to direct attention toward the United States, or does it actually cause him to lose face going into that party Congress?
Well, I don't think it's any accident, really, that the rhetoric of nationalism. I mean, China is not unique in this regard. I mean, there are lots of countries in the world in which the kind of nationalist, hawkish kind of sentiment is on the rise. But I think in the kind of state party society that China is, the government has been able to kind of nurture and kind of egg on nationalist sentiment, almost as a sort of a distraction from some of the more kind of troublesome things going on in the economy. And so the whole kind of reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, I mean, it wasn't just a peak, that they decided on the spur of the moment they'd give a kind of a demonstration of China's military in the South China Sea, because this operation must have been planned for a long time. It didn't look like it was like a kind of spur of the moment thing. So we can't be sure how much of this was kind of Nancy Pelosi's visit acting as a sort of a catalyst, or whether it was as anything kind of more or less than that. But it certainly proved to be the point that, the moment at which China chose to let loose its kind of military drills and display. And it does serve as a bit of a distraction from, as I said, the more troublesome things going on at home.
George, finally, you've mentioned the party plenum coming up, I guess, late October, early November, something like that. What will we be looking for to determine whether all of what you've just been talking about actually affects President Xi's position? My understanding is nobody thinks he won't get re-upped for an historic third term. But what about some of the people around him?
Yeah, so obviously the main focus is on the presumption that he will be crowned, as it were, for an unprecedented third term, unprecedented since Mao Zedong, of course, for a third term and maybe more, who knows. But the degree to which he gets his way, shall we say, in and with the party, I think will be read by many people by who gets kind of some of the senior appointments coming due. So the premiership or the role of premier in China, currently held by Li Keqiang, is falling due because of age limits. Also, Xi Jinping's economic czar, Liu He, is due to step down because of age limits, it is expected. So that's two positions. There'll be others on the Politburo and many, many more in senior party positions in regional governments and provincial governments. And the degree to which, Xi Jinping's people get sort of confirmed in new positions, I think, will give us an indication as to how much, whether his control is shaky in some respects or whether it's total.
Okay, George, it's always so beneficial to have you talk to us about China. Thank you so much. That is George Magnus of the Oxford China Center. Coming up, it's our Monday update on the path to the midterm elections in November with our political contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zeno. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time for our regular Monday segment, Midterms 2022, with Bloomberg political contributors Jeannie Shan Zeno of Iona University and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So we have a couple of very interesting ones today, tomorrow, I should say. Wyoming. Let's talk about Wyoming and Liz Cheney. This is part of what she had to say as part of her closing arguments in that primary.
America cannot remain free if we abandon the truth. The lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen is insidious. It preys on those who love their country. It is a door Donald Trump opened to manipulate Americans to abandon their principles, to sacrifice their freedom, to justify violence, to ignore the rulings of our courts and the rule of law. This is Donald Trump's legacy, but it cannot be the future of our nation.
There you go, complete with that lovely music behind it. So, Rick, I guess my basic question is this a swan song for Liz Cheney?
Well, this is a swan song. From the very start, she decided she was going to run her campaign against Donald Trump, not her opponent, Harriet Hageman. You notice she's not running campaign ads against Harriet. She's running them against Donald Trump. So her lot in life was to try and use her opportunity for re-election to try and contrast with Donald Trump and keep him in the news. She's done that. Her victory is already in the books. She just won't be a congresswoman after November.
Jeannie, will she be something else?
I think that's what we're all watching for. If you believe the latest polls out of Wyoming, she is down about 29, 30 points against Hageman. So it's going to be a blowout. And now I think what we're all watching for then is Tuesday night when the results come in. What does Liz Cheney say? And does she indicate that she is feeling her way into potentially a run against Donald Trump in 2024, or if she is going to think about running later. But, it is a big moment because this is the end of an era in Wyoming for the Cheney family, essentially. And, I was just thinking back, if you had imagined in December 2020, Liz Cheney was on the short list to potentially be the leader of the Republican Party in the House. And of course, very, very quickly after January 6th, when she decided that she could not abide by what many Republicans did with Donald Trump, she lost her leadership position and now looks poised to lose lose her House seat altogether. It's quite a stark transition.
Yeah, it is that, without a doubt. Let's move to Alaska. That's the one we'll learn about latest, given the time. May not even know it by tomorrow night. But Rick, let's start on the Senate side. There's a House and a Senate, but let's talk about the Senate side. And Lisa Murkowski, a true survivor.
Yeah, she is amazing. She has had to battle for every one of her re-elections. Even in 2010, she had to win on a write-in ballot, which is incredibly difficult. This time around, the system itself, the jungle primary, will probably benefit her in a way that she hasn't had in the past. So the top four come out of tomorrow with a ballot for the November elections. And I would even say the rank order voting, which is also a facet of Alaska elections this year, is probably going to benefit her too, by a lot of the Democrats dropping out early and those votes migrating to her. So I think it's advantage Murkowski for the first time probably in the last two re-elections.
So Jeannie, let's you and I give our friend Rick a break here and not start with him on Sarah Palin. I'm going to ask you about Sarah Palin, Jeannie.
Oh, please, maybe.
So tell us about Sarah Palin and what's going on up there.
Yeah, it's fascinating in Alaska this year because, of course, in 2020, Alaska voters voted to change their primary system, essentially just to get rid of it altogether, have everybody run on one ballot. And, of course, they thought this was all going to be tested tomorrow. And yet, when Don Young passed earlier this year, they then had to test it in June, as we talked about. And on that ballot was Sarah Palin. She made it into the top four, not surprisingly. And so tomorrow, voters will be voting in that special election to see who's going to serve out that term of Don Young's. And at the same time, they will be choosing from amongst a lot of candidates to see who will hold that seat for the next 2 years. So it's a little bit confusing up in Alaska, but Rick Davis's dear friend Sarah Palin is on the ballot, and I think you should ask him about that. She may win.
Jeannie, she could wake up on Wednesday potentially a congresswoman. But
she could.
Unfortunately, nobody will know it because they don't even think they'll get the ballots counted until August 31st. Yeah. So this is a complex process, and we'll see who comes out alive on this one.
So, Rick, this is all the primaries, but we're going to get to the general sooner or later. And let's talk about Pennsylvania, because there are a handful of those key Senate races that will determine who has the majority in the Senate. Let's talk about John Fetterman.
Yeah, this is a really critical race for Republicans. Obviously, it's a great opportunity for Democrats to pick up a Republican seat. But Fetterman has been, of course, off the campaign trail really since his nomination because of health issues. And this week was going to be his big debut, or was. And his speech in Erie, Pennsylvania, I think left people still scratching their heads saying, gee, is he really up for the task of a major campaign? And all the time that he's been off the trail, Oz, using his innate personality, has really become quite a legend right now in retail politics. He's showing up at every barbershop and cafe around the state making friends. And so this is a real contrast in style.
Yeah, we'll end up spending a lot of time talking about Pennsylvania. Coming up, Rick and Jeannie are going to be staying with us as we turn to the question of what, if any, effect on the midterm elections this investigation of former President Trump will have. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
No one is above the law. Donald Trump is not above the law, and Attorney General Garland is not above the law either. And Congress has the powers of oversight. He needs to comply. We've seen material like this before. We've seen materials that have been submitted to courts for warrants. This is not unprecedented. His actions are unprecedented.
That was Republican Representative from Ohio, Mike Turner. Bloomberg political contributors Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis are still with us. So, Rick, let me start with you. There's been an awful lot of coverage now of this FBI execution of a search warrant last week at the former residence of President Trump. We found out some of what they were after and what they took away with them on Friday. A lot of talk in the political circles. Is this going to have an effect on the midterms, do you think, Rick?
You know, this comes at a time when there's already been a bit of a sea change in voters' attitudes toward the parties in general, starting with the Supreme Court's decision around reversing Roe. There's been a real migration back to the Democratic Party from where it started at the very beginning of these elections. What was originally going to be a red wave now within the party is being seen as, can we hold on long enough to win the House and, get lucky maybe in the Senate? So I do sense from the strategists I've been talking to a real disappointment that this is just one more week now that we're not talking about inflation, we're not talking about the economy, we're not talking about Biden, we're talking about Donald Trump, who's not on anybody's ballot in 2022.
But Jeannie, my sense is that the former president, he loves being the center of attention.
He does. Who doesn't love it so much are Republicans in purple states. These are Republicans running in districts where, as Rick said, they want to be talking about inflation. They want to be talking about gas prices, the economy, Joe Biden's health. They don't want to be talking about former President Trump. And so you see a really stark difference between the full-throated defense of Donald Trump by Republicans that are in safer seats versus those in more purplish seats. We were just talking, for instance, about Senate candidate Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. He did not come out right away under pressure. He came out with a call for transparency. So we've seen that in North Carolina. We've seen that in Pennsylvania. The way in which this does benefit Republicans, that's in fundraising. They have been fundraising on this, particularly for small dollars. They can raise big small dollar numbers off of this, but they've got to be very careful in these swing states what they say, particularly because we haven't seen the affidavit. We don't know what was contained in those sets of boxes.
And Rick, that's just where I was going to go. You can call for transparency, but sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, because to some extent it depends on what's in the documents, right? If really they are not anything too controversial, that goes one way. On the other hand, if there are things like, for example, it's been talked about, nuclear secrets, I would think that that would really persuade even a lot of Republicans that this was not appropriate.
Well, you saw, David, the initial reaction before anybody even saw the original warrant was that Republicans were all aghast. Oh, my God, this is such an overreach. What a historical thing to search a former president's home. And then they see the list of items that were taken, including top secret material. Regardless of what it's about, it's top secret material. In fact, we're not even supposed to know what it's all about. It's top secret material. The more you say top secret, sitting in his dungeon with a lock on it is not going to be good for Republicans. And the overreaction by some Republicans talking about defund the FBI and things like that is taking away substantially a very good suburban issue for us on crime. So, I mean, the party is actually deconstructing around that issue in a way that I think a lot of real Republican leaders are looking at this going, gosh, how do we get out of this box as soon as possible? Of course, that's going to be up to the Department of Justice, not Republican leaders.
And Jeannie, I wonder, and this goes beyond politics, beyond voting, the reports of threats against law enforcement, I at least find appalling, really deeply troubling.
They are, and they should be to all Americans, and they obviously are. And any violence against any law enforcement official or threats of violence should be taken seriously. And that's, again, why politically Republicans in this case have to be careful about this rhetoric. Yes, Donald Trump deserves to be assumed innocent before, any charges, all of those things, and transparency is important. But these calls to defund the FBI and support and calls for threats of violence, those are going to be incredibly problematic as they go to the polls. And of course, for Americans in general, they should be.
Rick, what about this? I mean, particularly if we have actual acts of violence. We had the attack on Salman Rushdie, entirely unrelated subject, but things like that can turn around a campaign, can it not?
It can. I mean, I think we've seen some of these acts of violence, frankly, mass shootings, school shootings, things like that, actually really hurt the Democratic Party. The party in power is supposed to be able to protect its citizens, regardless of what state it's in. There's always been a significant amount of attention on crime and on these violent attacks this year. Every time you see something that happens in New York or Florida or California, people are galvanized by this. And now the Republicans are sitting there basically trying to denigrate the institutions of the FBI at a time when voters are most sensitive to these kinds of issues. So I really do think that Democrats have an opportunity here. The best news for Republicans is this is happening in August. Everybody's out at the beach and enjoying themselves and hopefully not paying much attention to this politically. But the reality is Donald Trump's created this bunker mentality for the party, and they have to go out and defend him every time something like this happens.
Yeah, everybody's at the beach, including the President of the United States, last time I checked. Thank you so much to Bloomberg political contributors Jeannie Shanzano of Iona University and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, we'll have a second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. Join us there. This is Bloomberg.